two new space-themed games to try out, one of which was far more interesting than the other. Today we're going to take a look at Boundary and System Shock. Both of these were available as demos on Steam Next Fest. Although they're not available to purchase just yet, they are going to be available right around the corner. Now, Steam Next Fest is unfortunately over as of this video. I would have liked to have got to this video last week, but I was away at ESA in Amsterdam, heading out to the European Space Agency to play a bit of Kerbal Space Program 2. I'll be talking more about that over the coming days. But yeah, the bottom line of that is I missed Steam and Next Fest, but not to worry, we're having a look at that right here. And we'll start with System Shock. This is a remake of the classic game from the 90s, I do believe, and System Shock 2, one of my favourite games of that era. This is the original though, and it is essentially a full remake with some very nice looking graphics, although made in the mould of that same time frame. Very much revealing here by some of the icons and some of the iconography we can see on the screen. Just look at that. So when you start a new game of System Shock, you can pretty much completely customize the experience. We can change the difficulty of combat, we can change the difficulty of missions, the cyber part of the gameplay, as well as the puzzles, and all separately and independent from each other. I mean, you get a very unique and very customized gameplay. Now we're going to cut the rather lengthy and totally unnecessary intro cutscene. Don't feel that it adds anything of value to the game, sure, aside to say that your character is blackmailed into helping out on this station. The station is under the control of a rogue AI known as Shodan, and throughout the area you will find it's now infested with zombies as well as rogue robots and other, well, hostiles. The game itself is an action RPG, played from first-person perspective, so there's stats for you to level up, items for you to collect, equipment for you to improve, and a story for you to play through. There's also a lot of similarities with Dead Space, pretty hard not to see the inspiration there. And of course the System Shock series ultimately led to the BioShock franchise. Not all the games are necessarily connected, in fact they're not connected really at all, but it's very easy to see the lineage there. As for the game itself, it's very clearly out of the 90s, both in terms of combat, gameplay and, well, story structure as well. Now I didn't get a long way through it, but one thing I did really have a bit of an issue with was the combat itself, not because of the pacing of the combat, but because of the lack of kinetic feedback. Just watch this, when you swing the wrench at any enemies, you really don't get the sensation that any impact is happening, so sometimes that makes it hard to judge whether the hit actually connected. For me, this made combat somewhat problematic, but combat with firearms on the other hand was much better. Another thing that feels like straight out of the 90s is the environment, and you can see that in spades on the screen right here, both in terms of the environmental design, but also the graphical style as well as the colour palette chosen. Now, arguably, this may only appeal to a niche audience, but on the other hand, it could have a pretty broad appeal in the same way that pixel art games sometimes do. But for me, on this one, I'm really not sure where I stand in terms of the graphics. On the one hand, they do feel appealing to me. After all, I did play these games back in the 90s. I was in my 20s at that point. But on the other hand, it feels very much like been there and done that. In terms of remakes then, it puts System Shock on a very different end of the spectrum to something like, say, Dead Space. With Dead Space modernising everything as much as absolutely possible and building upon all the lessons and technology learnt over the past 10 years or more. Whereas System Shock, well, this seems to be retreading old ground and trying to essentially rebuild a perfect 90s experience. Like I say, it does seem to work, but it may only appeal to a niche audience. Now, another area of the game which I did find particularly interesting is cyberspace. Essentially, it's a mini-game or a game within a game. So cyberspace is certainly its very own environment, and you'll feel that as you're flying around it and shooting up the enemies to boot. At any rate, with all that said and done, this is not a review or anything like that, simply giving my first impressions on the playthrough of the first sections of the System Shock demo. The demo itself is still available and you can find it linked in the video description below. This is available from Steam. Moving on, here's a very quick look at Boundary. Now this one has been in development for a very long time at this point. And yeah, it's a multiplayer shooter. If you like the arena type of shooters, then you're probably going to enjoy this. It's got its very own take on it, and that of course is zero-G environment. The combat itself is very pacey. It takes place on the game's or the current demo's singular map. You've got one environmental map outside that you can fly around the space stations here, or space station components, and another one that takes place inside a big warehouse. There's a couple of other areas as well, but the one thing in common is that they are all zero-G. Zero-G does add that extra dimension, of course, the extra third dimension, and that really changes things up if you used to play more traditional ground-based shooters. Now, I will say here that the demo for Boundary is very, very limited, and for me, it was nowhere near enough to get the impression or the idea as to whether or not I'd actually go ahead and purchase the game or play it for any length of time. For example, whilst the combat was certainly pacey, as I mentioned, it's certainly nowhere near as kinetic as the early videos seem to imply. At this point then, it's very difficult to get a good grasp on exactly what type of game Boundary is trying to be. Of course, we do have the developer's material and various bits of information out there, but right here, I'm judging the game purely on what I was able to experience in the demo. For that reason then, I'm not going to talk too much about Boundary other than to say that yeah, it seems pretty interesting and has quite a bit of potential. But if you want a closer look at it, the demo is still available. Just like with System Shock, I'll leave a link to both of these in the video description below. So yeah, if you have tried these out already, do let me know your thoughts on them in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you. Or if you've yet to try them out, then do check those links. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.